The afternoon Estelle Larimer hauled her late husband's battered writing desk out of the house his young widow now owned. The whole street understood the message being sent. After 50 years of marriage, this scarred, drawer-stuck wreck was the last thing anyone expected a woman like her to be left with, and she was expected to say thank you for it. Newly divorced at 74, with no home of her own and a settlement envelope too thin to stretch far, Estelle took the desk with a straight back and dry eyes, because she had never been a woman who begged for what was withheld. But what no one in Marley Fork could have guessed was that the desk everyone wrote off as junk was hiding, taped beneath its most stubborn drawer, a secret that within 90 days would turn the humiliation on its head and change the fate of 2 families for good. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The house on Dunmore Street had been theirs for 41 of those 50 years. Estelle knew it the way you know a thing you have kept up with your own hands. She knew which window stuck in August and needed a shoulder put to it. The hairline crack in the back step widened a little more each winter, and she knew that too. There was a soft place in the hallway floor where the boards gave underfoot, and her feet had learned the safe way around it so long ago that they found it now, without her thinking. She had chosen the wallpaper in the front room in 1979 out of a sample book the size of a paving stone. She had planted the dogwood by the mailbox the spring Corinne was born and had watched it go from a switch in the ground to a tree that threw shade across half the yard. 41 springs it bloomed. She left it standing there when she went. She left most of it behind. The good dishes that had come down from her grandmother, the quilt frame in the spare room, the kitchen table where 50 years of suppers had been set and cleared. She took a suitcase, 2 boxes of books, and the clothes that were hers, and nothing past that, because the things in that house had been bought with a life she was no longer living, and dragging them into a new one would only make the new one smell like the old. There was a kind of dignity in walking out with clean hands. Estelle had settled on it early, the week the lawyers began their letters, and she held to it the way she held to most things she decided, without noise and without turning around to see whether anyone had noticed. She was 74 years old. She had a daughter named Corinne who lived 2 hours south and called on Thursdays. Her son Grady lived closer and called less. The savings account held a number that would cover a few months of a small rent and not much more, and her body still worked if she was careful with it, and her mind had always run sharper than the men in her life gave it credit for. Everett had done the leaving first. That was the part the town chewed on longest. 50 years. And it was the husband who packed a bag at 76 and moved himself 12 miles to a newer house with a newer wife, as though the whole marriage had been a coat he could hang by the door on his way out. He married Colette 4 months after the divorce was final. Colette was 51, sold real estate, and had a laugh that carried clear across a parking lot. Then, before the first anniversary of any of it, Everett's heart gave out in his sleep, and the man who had rearranged 2 households to suit himself was gone before he had finished unpacking the second. Estelle did not come apart when she heard. She had already done that in private. Over the slow year, the marriage unraveled, and she had none of it left to spend on a funeral she attended from the 3rd row. She sat between Corinne and a cousin and watched Colette receive the town's sympathy from the front pew, and afterward she drove home to her rented rooms, made a pot of tea, and sat with it until it went cold. The will was read the following week. Everett had left the house to Colette. The cars, the accounts, the lake lot he had always meant to build on, all of it went to Colette. To Estelle, the wife of 50 years, the mother of his 2 children, the woman who had kept his books and raised his family and pressed his shirts for half a century, he left exactly one thing: his old writing desk. The lawyer read it out in the flat voice of a man who had learned long ago not to have opinions in a room like that. And for a moment, no one spoke. Corinne's hand found her mother's under the table and held on hard. Grady stared at the carpet. Behind him, a cousin made the small sound people make when they have watched something land worse than they brace for. It was not even a good desk. Everyone in that room had seen it. That was the scarred oak thing Everett kept in the back study for 40 years, where he did the household accounts, with the drawer that stuck and the water ring on top, and the veneer peeling at one corner where the afternoon sun had gotten to it. Estelle had asked him to drag it to the curb a dozen times across the decades. He never would. To the room, and to the town that heard about it by supper time, the message could not have read plainer. 50 years of a woman's life, and the man had reached to the very bottom of the pile and handed her the one piece of furniture nobody else would take. Estelle heard it the same way everyone else did. She thanked the lawyer, stood, straightened her coat, and told him she would arrange to collect it. Then she walked out past a row of faces arranged in careful sympathy, drove home with both hands on the wheel and her chin level, and let nothing show until the car door was shut and the engine was off and there was no one left to hold it together for her. What Estelle did not know yet, what none of the people in that room could have guessed, was that the desk was the most deliberate thing Everett Coyle had done in years. Estelle had not drawn a paycheck in more than 50 years, and that had been a decision, not a failure. She had worked as a young woman, keeping the books mornings at a feed store on the square and taking and sewing at night, back when her hands were quick and her eyes did not need the good lamp pulled close. When she married Everett, she let the feed store go and kept the needle because that was the arrangement then and it suited them both. She stitched hems and let out waistbands and turned collars for half the women in Marley Fork across the decades, and the small money from it went into a jar over the stove and paid for the things Everett's paycheck did not quite reach. His household accounts, she kept the whole marriage to the dollar, which was more than Everett ever troubled to know about his own affairs. None of it counted now. 50 years of thrift and careful stitching had left no pension, no deed with her name on it, no line on a form that a bank would read as safe. The sewing had been cash in a jar, and the jar had gone the way of the house. She sat at the little table in her rented rooms the week after the will was read and did the arithmetic the way she had always done it, plainly, without looking away from the total. The rent took the greater part of what came in each month. What remained would carry her through the summer if nothing broke, and she was careful at the market. Past the summer, the page was blank. The marriage itself had not ended in a single afternoon. It had worn through slowly, the way a coat wears through at the elbows first, in the places you stop checking because you assume they will hold. Somewhere past 70, Everett had grown restless in a way she had no good name for. He spoke of time running short. There was a red truck he did not need, and clubs he joined and quit inside season. He looked at the life they had built together, the paid-off house and the soft old furniture, and the wife who knew him too well to be dazzled by him. And he decided, in the private way men decide such things, that he had been shortchanged somewhere along the road. He never said it to her face. Everett was not a cruel man, only a weak one by the end, and weakness at 76 does more quiet damage than cruelty, because it carries less shame to slow it down. He packed while she was working the church rummage sale on a Saturday. She came home to half the closet empty and a note propped against a sugar bowl that explained nothing and apologized for even less. She read it once, folded it in half, and put it in the drawer with the warranties and the expired coupons, where it seemed to belong. Colette had been a client of all things. Estelle had taken an address for her 2 summers back, a green one that wanted the waist moved, and had pinned it on the woman in her own front room while Everett watched a ball game from the next share and said nothing worth remembering. She did not let herself sit long with that picture. It changed nothing, and she had never had the patience for the kind of grief whose only work is to dig its hole a little deeper. Corinne took it harder than her mother did, or showed it more, which was not the same thing. She called every Thursday evening and drove up the first Sunday of the month, and she had offered more than once to make up the spare room in her own house 2 hours south. Estelle thanked her each time and declined each time. A woman did not spend 50 years running her own household only to close it out as a guest in her daughter's back bedroom. Grady was a different matter. He lived 11 miles off and had inherited his father's gift for being somewhere else the moment a thing turned hard. He had come to the funeral, stood with his hands in his pockets, said the correct words to the correct people, and had not telephoned his mother once in the weeks since. Estelle did not hold it against him the way another woman might have. She had raised a boy, and she knew the tender place in him that sent him running from anything he could not repair with his hands. That grieved her more than the money did, if she was honest, and she generally was. The town, for its part, had opinions and was not shy about carrying them home from the market. 50 years is long enough that a couple stops being 2 people and becomes a fixture like the courthouse clock or the stone soldier on the square, and when a fixture comes down, the whole place feels the hole where it stood. People were kind to her in the careful, sidelong manner of a small town, which is a kindness with a splinter buried in it. Talk changed shape a little when she came down the aisle at the IGA. Old friends held her hand a beat too long and searched her face for the crack they expected to find. She gave them nothing to carry off in either direction, because what came next was her own business, and it was very nearly the only thing left that she could still call hers. That was the true shape of the problem, and it had little to do with the desk or the town or the sympathy pressed on her at the register. Estelle Larimer was 74 years old, beginning again with a suitcase and a scarred oak desk, and she had not yet found the first thread to pull. The desk had to be fetched from the house on Halstead Road, which meant driving out to a place that had never once been hers to collect the only piece of her old life she had been allowed to keep. She set it for Tuesday. A young man named Levi, who did odd jobs around the Methodist church and kept a pickup, agreed to help for gas money and a pan of cornbread he remembered from potluck. They drove out in the flat light of a gray afternoon, the empty truck bed banging over every seam in the road, and Estelle folded her hands in her lap and watched the fields go by and let the boy carry the conversation, which he was happy to do. Colette was in the driveway before the truck had rolled to a stop. She had the desk out already, set on the concrete of the garage, apron the way people set things at the curb on trash morning. There had been no offer to come inside. She stood with her arms crossed over a cream cardigan and her car keys pinched in one hand, a woman with somewhere else to be. Selling houses had taught her to keep people moving, and she started in on it before Estelle's shoes touched the drive. "There it is," Colette said. "I had it brought around this morning so you wouldn't have to come through the house." Easier all around. Easier for Colette. Both women knew the true weight of the word, and neither one bent to pick it up. Colette looked down at the desk, and her face pinched the way a tidy person's does at clutter she has finally been given leave to be rid of. "I'll be honest with you, I never understood the thing," she said. "He made the movers haul it over when we bought this place. Wouldn't hear of leaving it behind. It sat in the back room ever since, taking up half the floor, and I could not tell you why to save my life. You're doing me a favor carrying it off, if you want the truth of it." There it was, laid out plain on a slab of concrete. The one thing left to Estelle after 50 years, and she was meant to receive it as a kindness she was doing for the woman who had gotten all the rest. Estelle crossed to the desk and laid her palm flat on the scarred top, over the pale ring where a glass had once stood too long. The oak was cool under her hand. She could feel the small lift of the veneer peeling at the corner, the grain worn smooth by 40 years of use. "He did the accounts on it," she said. "Every Sunday night we were married. Sat down after supper and squared the books to the dollar." She was speaking to the desk more than to Colette, or to some part of herself that still needed telling. Then she stood straight and met the younger woman's eyes, and her voice came out level and pleasant and closed. "Thank you for keeping it safe for him. We won't hold you up." Colette blinked, caught between the barb and the courtesy, and unable to get a grip on either one. She said something about wishing it could have been more, in the automatic way of a person signing off on a sale, and then she was in her car and backing down the drive, and the whole business of 50 years was finished in under 4 minutes on a square of gray concrete. Levi loaded the desk into the truck bed with the careless strength of the young, roped it down, and they drove home with Estelle's hand resting on the door and her chin held level and nothing at all moving in her face. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They carried it into her rented rooms together, into the corner by the front window where the light fell best in the afternoon. Levi set it down, ate 2 squares of cornbread standing at the counter, thanked her twice, and let himself out. Then the rooms went still, and it was only Estelle and the desk and the sound of the refrigerator ticking over. She lowered herself into a kitchen chair and looked at it a good long while. Up close, in her own space, it was worse and it was better both. Worse because every hurt in it showed under the lamp, the water rings and the raw scarring and the drawer that hung a half-inch proud of its neighbors and refused to sit flush. Better because it was his. The smell of the old study had ridden home with it, Faint pipes, smoke, and dry paper, and the particular dust of a drawer opened and shut 10,000 times. She slid out the top drawer, the one that ran smooth, and found a pencil worn down to its last 2 inches and a sheet of paper gone soft along the folds. When she opened it, there was Everett's cramped hand and faded pencil. A grocery tally from some ordinary Sunday she would never be able to put a date to. She held the paper a long time. No tears came, though the empty room would have kept the secret. 50 years had come down to a scarred desk, a pencil stub, and a column of a dead man's arithmetic, and the man himself was gone well past the reach of any apology, having spoken his last word to her through a lawyer in a flat little office. Grief was a thing Estelle had always met the same way, by handing her hands a job and keeping them at it until the worst of the ache had passed on through her. Sitting still with sorrow had never once mended a thing she owned. So she made herself a plan, the way she made a plan for anything too big to look at whole. First, the desk would be cleaned down to the grain, top to bottom. Then she would work that stuck drawer loose and find out what was binding it. The scarring she would rub away where it would go and leave in peace where it would not. And the whole of it she would make sound again, because the desk was hers now, and she would not let it sit in her front room as a monument to how little she had been handed. She found oil, soap, and clean rags under the sink, and set to work that same evening, while the good light held. Corinne drove up the following Saturday and brought Sadie, her granddaughter, who was 7 and met the world as a series of things worth investigating. They came in the late morning with a grocery sack and a rotisserie chicken and a bag of Sadie's things. And for a day and a half, the small rented rooms held more life than they had since Estelle signed the lease. The child made a circuit of the place inside 10 minutes and reported back on all of it. There was a window that looked straight at a bird feeder somebody in the next unit had hung. The bathroom faucet ran hot faster than the one at home. The closet was exactly the right size to be a fort if a person had a blanket and permission, and after some negotiation, the person had both. They ate at the little table that first evening, the 3 of them close enough that elbows touched, and Estelle watched her great-granddaughter narrate a story about a classmate that had no clear beginning and showed no sign of an ending, and something in her chest that had been holding tight for weeks let go a half-turn. Corinne caught her mother's eye across the table. Nothing was said. Nothing needed saying. It was the particular look that passes between a mother and a grown daughter who both understand the true size of a thing and have agreed, without a word, to let the evening be lighter than the facts would allow. It lasted a second, maybe 2, and it carried everything. "It's like a camp-out," Sadie announced, meaning the whole arrangement, the small rooms and the fort and the great-grandmother sleeping so near. "It surely is," Estelle said. They left Sunday after lunch. Corinne held on a beat too long at the car and told her mother to call if she needed anything at all, in a voice that meant it. And Estelle promised she wouldn't a voice that meant she probably wouldn't. And then the taillights went down the road, and the rooms were quiet again in the particular way rooms are quiet after a child has left them. Estelle washed the few dishes, dried her hands, and turned to the desk. She had gotten the top cleaned down to the grain over the past week, working an hour or 2 each evening while the light held, and the old oak had come up warmer than she expected under the oil soap, the color of strong tea where the sun had not bleached it. The scarring on the surface she had made peace with. What still troubled her was the drawer, the lower one on the right, that hung proud of its neighbors and drag whenever she worked it, catching on something up inside the frame that 40 years of Everett's yanking had never cured. Tonight, she meant to settle it. She pulled the drawer all the way out to its stop, worked it past the catch with a rock of her wrists, and lifted it free of the runners. Then she set it on the kitchen table upside down to see what had been fouling the slide. The underside was plain oak, dusty, unremarkable. She ran her hand along out of habit, the way she checked a hem for a pin she had missed, and her fingers found a hard flat shape where no hard flat shape belonged. Taped to the underside of the drawer, up near the back where a hand would never brush it in ordinary use, was a small brass key. The tape had gone amber and brittle with age, but it had held, pressed down at all 4 corners by someone who had taken care that it hold. This was no key that had slipped down behind and lodged by accident. Someone had turned this drawer over exactly as she had, laid the key against the wood, and sealed it there on purpose, in the one spot in the whole desk that would stay hidden until the day a person had reason to take the thing entirely apart. Estelle worked it loose with her thumbnail and held it up onto the kitchen lamp. It was smaller than a house key and heavier than it looked, brass gone dark with handling, the kind of key that was cut for a lock a person was meant to trust. Stamped into the flat of it were 4 numbers and nothing else. No name, no maker, nowhere to say what door or drawer or box in all the world it had been made to open. Just the numbers, worn shallow by a thumb that had rubbed the same spot many times over. She sat down slowly with the key in her palm. It was his desk. 40 years his, and the drawer had been sealed long enough for the tape to turn amber, which meant Everett had hidden it, and hidden it years back, and kept it hidden through the move to Colette's house, and clear through to the reading of a will that handed his wife of 50 years one piece of scarred furniture and called it settled. He had wanted her to have the desk. Estelle understood that now, with a certainty that made the room feel very still. Not the accounts, not the cars, not the house. The desk, and the things sealed inside it, and the small brass key that was the only way through. She turned it over once under the lamp, and then again, and the 4 war numbers gave up nothing at all. The knock came on a Wednesday, 2 women and a foil-covered plate. Wanda Selby lived in the unit at the end of the row and had watched the pickup deliver the desk the week before from behind her kitchen curtain, which she admitted freely, being a woman who saw no sense in pretending she minded other people's business less than she did. She had brought her friend Cordy Fitch and a plate of lemon squares, and the 2 of them stood on Estelle's small stoop in the late morning cool like a delegation. "We won't stay if you're busy," Wanda said, already halfway through the door. "We just thought you ought to know which of your neighbors are worth knowing." They stayed an hour. Cordy was the quieter of the 2, a retired school secretary with soft hands and a gift for the kind of silence that invites a person to fill it, and Wanda talked enough for all 3 of them. They knew who Estelle was. Everyone did. They knew the whole of it, the 50 years and the young widow and the desk, and they had the grace not to pick at any of it, which Estelle marked and was grateful for. What they did instead was fold her in. Cordy mentioned a granddaughter's christening gown that needed the lace reset, and no one within 40 miles she trusted touch it. Wanda had heard, through the church, that the Pruitt girl was getting married in the fall, and the mother of the bride was in a state about alterations. By the time the lemon squares were gone, Estelle had 2 jobs promised and the names of 3 more women who would be calling. The work came the way water comes back to a dry creek bed, slow at first, and then steadier, one job seeding the next. A hem let down, led to a coat taken and led to a whole box of a dead woman's dresses that a daughter could not bear to give away until they had been made to fit her own frame. Estelle set up her machine on the clean top of the desk, in the good light by the front window, and her hands remembered everything they had ever known. The money came in small and honest, and hers. Cash folded into the same kind of jar she had kept over a stove for 50 years, and every bill that went into it was a bill that no lawyer and no will and no younger woman had any say over. The key she kept in her apron pocket the whole while, and it turned over and over in her mind as her hands turned the cloth. She could not simply carry it to a bank. She had 4 war numbers and no name to go with them, and the thought of standing at a teller's window, trying to explain a dead man's brass key, made her feel every one of her 74 years. It was Cordy, of all people, who gave her the thread. They were sitting over coffee the second week, the christening gown spread between them, when Estelle let slip that she had found an old key of Everett's and could not place the lock. Cordy did not pry. She only said that if a key was worth placing, there was one man in Marley Fork who could place it, and his shop was on the square, and his name was Amos Tolliver. He fixes clocks mostly. Now his eyes have settled, Cordy said. But he was the locksmith here 40 years. If it turns a lock, Amos has seen its cousin. The shop sat on the north side of the square between a shuttered pharmacy and a tax office, a narrow storefront with Tolliver painted on the glass in gold gondole. A bell over the door announced her. Inside, the walls ticked, 100 clocks keeping 100 slightly different opinions of the hour, and behind the counter a big man in his 70s looked up from a movement no bigger than a walnut and set down his loop. Amos Tolliver had the unhurried way of a man who had spent his life around mechanisms that could not be rushed. He listened to her explain herself without once looking impatient for her to be done. When she laid the brass key on the felt pad he kept on the counter, he did not touch it right away. He looked at it, turned the lamp toward it, and only then picked it up and held it close to his good eye. "Well now," he said. He weighed it in his palm, ran a thumb over the 4 stamp numbers, and something in his face changed, the small settling of a man who has just recognized an old acquaintance across a room. "This isn't a house key, and it isn't a padlock. See how short the blade is, how deep the cuts. This is a safe deposit key, one of a pair. There'd have been a second one the bank kept, and it took both turned together to open the box." He set it back on the felt as carefully as he had lifted it. "These numbers are the box, not the bank. The bank's name is off it, which usually means the box is old, or the bank's changed hands, or both." Estelle stood very still on the other side of the counter. "My wife used to say I loved a locked thing more than an open one," Amos said, and there was no self-pity in it, only the plain report of a fact. "Alma. She's been gone 6 years now. She'd have liked this. A key with no door." He looked up at Estelle, and his eyes were kind and steady and in no particular hurry. "You want to find out what your husband locked away? We can find it. It'll take some looking, but a box like this doesn't just forget its own door." The mending outgrew the jar over the stove by the second month. Word of Estelle's needle traveled the way word travels in a town that size, pew to pew and hand to hand, and it did not stay inside Marley Fork for long. A woman drove over from Elkwater with a wedding dress that had belonged to her mother and needed 40 years let out of it. The funeral home on the highway started sending the suits that did not quite fit the men they were meant for, delicate work that most seamstresses would not touch, and the families remembered afterward how steady her hand had been. Cordy kept finding her heirlooms one at a time. Wanda appointed herself something between a manager and a town crier, and was good at both. By the middle of the second month, there was more cloth waiting on the desk than one woman could clear in a day's light, and Estelle did a thing she had not done in 50 years. She turned work away. She sat at the machine one evening with 3 dresses hanging and a 4th just promised, and it came to her that the front room of a rented unit was not the right size for whatever this was turning into. The thought carried her mother with it, the way certain thoughts do. Her mother had kept a little dress shop on Main Street when Estelle was a girl, 2 rooms with a bell on the door and bolts of cloth stood up in the window where the light could show their color. Estelle had learned her whole trade on that hardwood floor with a mouthful of pins, and she had loved it the way you love the place that first made you good at something. The family lost the shop the year her father's health went. They sold the lease and the fixtures to pay the doctors, and a hardware store took the space, and then a laundrette, and then nothing at all. She had not let herself want it back in 40 years. Wanting a thing that far gone was a poor use of an evening. She set the memory down where she always set it and went back to the seam. Amos, in the meantime, had gone hunting. "Calvert's Savings and Trust," he said when she came by the shop that Thursday, and he tapped a card where he had written it in a careful hand. "That was your bank back when. Calvert closed its doors better than 20 years ago and got swallowed by Piedmont Federal, and Piedmont got swallowed in its turn by one of the big regionals out of Charleston. Every time a bank eats another bank, the safe deposit boxes have to go somewhere, because the law will not let them simply disappear. Those old Calvert boxes were carried over to the branch in Elkwater, and they have been sitting in that vault ever since, waiting on the keys that match them. He had gotten this from a man named Doyle who had run the Calvert branch in its last years, and now took the same booth at the same diner every morning that Amos did. 40 years of fixing a town's locks leaves a man with a thread to nearly everyone in it. They drove to Elkwater together the next week in Amos's truck, which was old and clean and smelled of machine oil and the peppermints he kept in the console. He did not crowd the drive with talk, which she found she liked. When he spoke, it was to point out a barn he had rekeyed in 1985 or a church whose bell he still wound twice a year. Somewhere past the county line, he said, plainly and without making a thing of it, that it had been a long while since he had a reason to drive somewhere with company, and that he was glad of the errand, whatever it turned up. Estelle said she was glad of the company. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. The branch in Elkwater was all glass and cold air. A manager half Estelle's age took the key, read the 4 numbers, and went away into a back room for what felt like a long time. When she came back, she had a card in her hand and a puzzled set to her mouth. "The box is still active," she said. "One of the old Calvert boxes. Moved here when we took the accounts over. The rent's paid current. Paid a long way current, matter of fact. Somebody prepaid it years out, all at once." She looked at the card again. "And it's not in the name I expected. You told me your husband kept the key." "He did," Estelle said. "The box is registered to an Estelle Larimer. Sole holder. That's the only name on the card. Larimer. Her own name, her mother's name, the name she had carried as a girl on the floor of a dress shop and taken back for herself the day the divorce was final. Everett had put this box in that name years before there was any divorce to take a name back from. He had rented it, prepaid it out past the end of his own life, so it could never lapse and be drilled open, and sign it to a woman who did not legally exist yet, because on the day he did it, she was still Estelle Coyle, and would stay Estelle Coyle for years to come. Because the box was hers, and hers alone, no one could question her right to open it. The manager brought her through the heavy door into the vault, where the boxes ran floor to ceiling in brass rows, and fitted the bank's guard key into the small lock beside Estelle's number. Then she stepped back and let Estelle set her own dark key into the second hole. "Both together," the manager said gently. "Turn them at the same time." Amos stood at the vault door with his hat in his hands, a big patient man in a place that kept its own kind of time. He gave her a small nod. Estelle turned the two keys together. The little door gave with a sound like a hell breath let go. She drew out the long steel drawer, heavier than she had braced for, and carried it to the narrow table against the wall, and for a moment she only stood over it with both palms flat on the cold lid. 50 years of marriage. A scarred desk on a slab of concrete. A brass key with no door to call its own. It had all come down to a steel box in a town not her own, and to the last few seconds before she would know what a dead man had sealed inside it. She lifted the lid. The box held paper and nothing that shone. That was her first thought, looking down into the long steel drawer. No jewels, no banded stacks of bills. Only a soft brown accordion envelope gone limp at the corners, and a smaller sealed one laid on top of it with her name written across the front in Everett's cramped pencil. Estelle. Nothing else. She stood over the drawer in the cold vault light, and did not reach for either one straight away. She opened the accordion envelope first, because it was thicker, and because she was not ready yet for the one with her name on it. Inside were deeds and receipts, ordered the way Everett ordered a thing, when he cared how it came out. The top sheet was a deed of sale dated 19 years back for the two-room storefront at 114 Main Street. She knew the address the way she knew the backs of her own hands. It was her mother's shop, the place with the bell on the door and the bolts of cloth stood up in the window, the hard floor where she had learned her whole trade with a mouthful of pins. Everett had bought it. The seller was some holding company that had let the place sit empty for years, and the buyer, printed plain and read 3 times to be sure the light was not fooling her, was Estelle Larimer. Her maiden name, on a deed dated years before any divorce could have given that name back to her, when she still signed everything Coyle and thought she always would. Behind the deed were the tax receipts, one for every year since, each stamp paid and on time. Under those, a savings passbook from the old Calvert Bank, the deposits entered by hand in a teller's careful figures. Small sums, $30 and $40 at a stretch, laid in month after month across 2 decades, the exact size and rhythm of a jar filled a little at a time over a stove. By the last entry, the modest sums had grown into a number that would carry a person a good long while, and had a purpose already spent on it before she ever saw it. She sat down on the hard vault chair with the passbook in her lap, and, finally, opened the letter. His hand had gotten worse toward the end, and the pencil wandered off the line, but she could read it. Estelle, I was never any good at saying things to your face, and I've been worse than no good these last years. So I'm doing it this way, which is the coward's way, and I know it. I bought your mother's shop when it came up. I put in your name, your real name, the one you had before me. I have paid it every year, and I have set money by for it, so you would not have to. I cannot fix what I turned into. I know what I cost you, but I could give you back the floor you learned to sew on, and so I did, and I hid the key where I knew you would be the only one who ever bothered to work that drawer loose. Do something with it. It was always more yours than mine. Everett. Estelle read it twice. Then she folded it along the soft creases and held it in both hands. And no tears came, which did not surprise her anymore. The man had spent his last word on her after all. He had spent it years in advance and sealed it under a drawer, and left the lawyer to say the cold part in the flat little office so this part could wait for her here, in her mother's town, in her own true name. Amos had stayed at the vault door the whole while, his hat in his hands. He did not ask. When she was ready, she told him what the box held in a level voice, and he listened the way he did everything, without rushing her toward the end of it. The bank manager, when Estelle asked her plainly, confirmed what the papers already said. The building and the account stood in the name of Estelle Larimer, sole holder, from a date years before the divorce. They had never been Everett's to leave in a will, and had never been Colette's to inherit. Whatever Colette believed she had swept up when she took the house, this had never been inside her reach. Estelle felt no rush of triumph at that, only a slow, settling quiet, the feeling of a floor coming level under furniture that had rocked for a long time. They drove home into a low sun. For a good many miles, neither of them said much, and the peppermint smell of the cab and the tick of the engine were company enough. Somewhere past the county line, Amos spoke. I miss Alma every day, and it's a clean kind of missing, he said. She was good to me, and I knew it while I had her. There's no splinter in it, just the empty chair. He kept his eyes on the road. Yours is a harder thing to carry. You're grieving a man who did you wrong and did you right, and both at the same time, and there's no clean way to hold that. No, Estelle said. There isn't. Different weights, he said. Same work of setting them down and going on. She looked over at him, at the plain, steady profile of a man who fixed lock things for a living, and found she had nothing to add to it, because he had said it exactly right. He drove her past 114, Main Street on the way, without being asked, and slowed the truck to a crawl at the curb. The two rooms sat dark behind dusty glass, the old fixtures long gone, a faded sign in the window from some business that had failed years back. Estelle looked through the dirty pane at the hardwood floor where a girl had once knelt with a mouthful of pins, and she did not have to think it over for very long. I'm going to open it back up, she said. My mother's shop, in her name and mine. I believe you are, Amos said. The shop at 114, Main Street, opened its door again on a Saturday in the first week of October. It had taken the better part of the 2 months' remainder to ready it. Estelle used whatever it had set by exactly as he had meant it to be used, and not $1 of it went to waste. The old floor was sanded and oiled until the grain came up gold the way she remembered it from her knees as a girl. A glazier reset the front window, and she stood bolts of cloth up in it where the morning light could show their color, the reds and the deep greens, the way her mother had taught her that cloth sells itself if you let the sun do the asking. Amos rekeyed the door and hung a bell over it. A real brass bell off one of his own shells that he would not take money for, and when the door swung, the bell spoke in a clear high note that carried her 50 years back in a single breath. She hung a sign that read Larimer's, because the simplest name had always been the right one, and because it was her mother's name and her own, and it belonged over that door more than any other word could. Wanda had spread the news for a fortnight, so there was a small crowd on the walk before Estelle turned the latch. Cordy came with the whole altar guild. The woman from Elkwater drove over with the mother's wedding dress, finished now, to be the first thing hung in the window as a showpiece. Corinne took the morning off and brought Sadie, who appointed herself the greeter and stood at the door telling every soul who came through that her great-grandmother had learned to sew on this very floor, which was true, and which she delivered with the certainty of a child who has found a fact worth carrying. By 10, the 2 little rooms were full. By noon, there was a line on the sidewalk, women with hems and men with suit coats, and girls whose prom dresses wanted taking in, and behind them the merely curious who had heard the story and wanted to lay eyes on the woman it happened to. Estelle worked the counter and took the tickets and pinned what needed pinning. And somewhere in the middle of it, she stopped being able to think about anything past the next seam, which was the surest sign she had ever known that a thing was working. The county paper ran it the following week, 3 columns and a photograph. A reporter had come by on the opening morning and gotten the whole of it. The shop that had been her mother's and had sat dark for 40 years, the 50-year marriage, and the will that left her one scarred desk, and the key taped beneath a drawer that no one but the widow had ever bothered to work loose. The headline called Larimer's the best thing to happen to Main Street in a decade. The reporter had the good sense to end on the shop and not the sorrow, so the piece read like a beginning. Colette read it at her kitchen table on a Sunday morning. This was told afterward by people in a position to know and inclined to share, which in Marley Fork is most people. She read it through once, and then, they said, she read it again, more slowly, and set the paper down and sat with a look on her face that no one who described it could ever quite put a word to, though everyone who heard described understood it at once. The desk she could not wait to be rid of, the junk she had all but shoved down the driveway to get it gone, had carried the one key to everything Everett had put beyond her reach. She had handed it away herself, in under 4 minutes, glad to see the back of it. Estelle did not read that particular piece of talk, and would not have spent an evening on it if she had. She had a shop to run. The proposal, when it came, matched the man who made it. Amos came by on a Sunday morning near the end of it with 2 coffees and the particular stillness of someone who has finished turning a thing over and only has the saying of it left. The shop was closed and quiet, the machine idle, the light coming in soft through the front glass and lying across the gold floor. He handed her a coffee. He looked at the bell he had hung over the door, and then he said what he had come to say, plainly, the way he said everything. Estelle was quiet a moment, in a way she went quiet before anything that mattered, taking it in before she answered. Then she said yes. She said it without any performance of weighing it, because she had done her weighing already over a good many miles of a truck that smelled of peppermints and machine oil, beside a man who fixed lock things and had never once in all those weeks made her feel she was building something too small or starting something too late. She told Corinne that evening, and Corinne's smile was the slow, certain kind of a woman confirming what she had seen coming for weeks. Sadie had a great many questions, chiefly concerning whether the clock shop and the dress shop would now be one shop, and whether that meant she could wind the clocks. Some ordinary Tuesday, not long after, Estelle stood behind the counter at Larimer's with a ticket in her hand and Sadie underfoot sorting spools by color into a wooden tray. The bell over the door rang. A woman came in with a coat over her arm, and Estelle already knew from the drape of it where the seam had gone, the way she could read most garments before they reached the counter. She asked the woman what she needed anyway, and let her be the one to say it, because being asked is part of what a person comes in for, and it costs nothing to hand it to them. If you have ever been handed the smallest, sorriest piece of a life you gave everything to, and been expected to say thank you for it, if you have ever started over with less than you were sure you could stand on, at an age when the world had quietly decided you were finished, then you already know what Estelle Larimer knew standing behind that counter, with her mother's floor under her feet and her own name over the door. She did not merely reopen a dress shop. She took the one thing meant to shame her, worked its stubborn drawer loose the way no one else ever cared to, and turned it into the door back to everything she thought she had lost. What they hand you to make you small is not always the end of the story. Sometimes it is the key to the rest of it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.